Have Hoyo figured out how to handle the weight of their past mistakes? Genshin's story is a sprawling epic which has made slow progress over many years. There's a pretty clear consensus that the quality bar started a little low but rose over time, with some hiccups along the way, though there's eternal debate over which of the nations from Sumeru onwards was the best. For me, at least, Nod Krai stands out as an example of what it should have been all along. It had most of the good parts without most of the bad parts. However, even though Nod Krai gave us movement in the traveler's own story and integrated much more of the deeper lore into the central narrative, I was left wondering how they'd handle all those vital pieces they neglected in past regions' Archon Quests. They could have let it all fade into irrelevance, but then what would be the point? Instead, the next chapter in the story saw us finally return to Sumeru. For years, I found myself highlighting the same old flaws in every new chapter of Genshin's story. It was good enough to keep me coming back, but it was frustrating to see its potential wasted over and over again because of the same mistakes. If you're curious to hear it all laid out in detail, I made a video in the midst of the Natlan arc which looked at their approach from a general perspective, plus a follow-up which explains why we should hold Hoyo to high standards. The biggest issues were the presentation, story structure, and character dynamics. Things like dialogue bloat, lack of subtext, static cinematography, and environmental storytelling. Weak hooks, contrived plots, disconnected lore, and the good parts constantly relegated to side quests. Characters remaining static and their relationships left unchanged, regardless of what they went through. The world had some fascinating themes, but the Archon Quests mostly skimmed past them, and the consequences too were underwhelming. Suffice to say, I was very surprised when Hoyo did an extra developer livestream where they acknowledged many of these storytelling mistakes and promised to fix them through the addition of Nod Krai. And, as I've explored in a more recent video, if you look back at each of those things I highlighted as a problem, they made some huge improvements on more or less all of them in Nod Krai. It was not a groundbreaking or mind-blowing story in any real sense, but I'd argue it's more important that they get the basics right first and then they can reach for something special. The presentation still falls behind the competition, but it was a significant step in the right direction on all counts. The hooks and plot structure were much improved, and the lore integration felt like an entirely different game in many ways. And the characters were the true highlight. They felt dynamic, they changed, they had a web of interesting relationships which evolved over time as they faced challenges together and fought their way to victory. It still did have its rough patches, like the jarring integration of Nefer's story or the sidelining of Flynn's, not to mention the disappointment of the Pale Star Edict. And there were related issues too, gigantic quests which made it hard to figure out where you could take a break without having to replay 20 minutes of yapping or more, for example, or the frustrating time gate for the Selenia Chronicles, which becomes completely farcical for anyone who didn't play along as the patch is released. But overall, I've loved Nod Krai, and this is the first time I can say they've consistently met my minimum expectations across an entire arc. But while those improvements worked great in Nod Krai, when it came to past regions, Hoyo would face a bigger challenge. They've always filled the game with everything from tiny snippets of lore lurking in obscure corners to epic world quests with their own cast of characters which explored entire worlds of lore and history. Many loved those world quests for all sorts of reasons, and for a lot of people, they were the main motivation which kept them playing the game. However, they were not integrated into the Archon Quests at all. And as a consequence, people who focused on the main story and either skipped or maybe skimmed the side content either know nothing of the characters and ideas they explored, or likely saw them as mildly interesting but mostly irrelevant background noise. The big challenge Hoyo left themselves is how to bridge that gap when revisiting older regions. Their new approach integrates all this into the main quests. Their past approach did not. When the story seeks to continue threads left unfinished in past regions, this becomes a problem. If they focus on new things only, all the time and love people invested into those old stories would feel disrespected, callously thrown away. If they include all those characters and concepts without bringing the more casual fans up to speed, the story would either feel incredibly confusing to them, or the characters would feel like pointless nostalgia bait which didn't matter to the story. Either way, people would lose interest. But at the same time, these things took dozens of hours to explore in the first place, so if they try to get those people to truly know the context, they'd risk making the experience incredibly tedious to those who did pay attention. The casual fans would still miss out on the depth of any emotional moments, but they'd also be ruined for the people who cared already. In the end, it's a trade-off between accessibility and payoffs. The weight of their past mistakes led them to a situation where there is no perfect answer which could work for everyone. So, once it was confirmed we were going back to Sumeru, what were my expectations? Of course, I'd expected them to continue with many of the positives showcased throughout Nod Krai. The bar for cinematography, dialogue, subtext, character growth, and so on has been raised, and it would have been a massive mistake for them to revert to their lower standards. I expected the long-awaited continuation of some of the threads which were left unresolved by the time we left Sumeru. Nahida's journey from insecurity to confidence, Wanderer's lingering anger towards Dottore, the consequences of the huge changes brought about by our thwarting of the Doctor's plans, and, of course, Collei's haunting vision of the burning of Irminsul. I was pretty sure that Dottore must have found some way to trick Nahida to avoid deleting his copies of himself, but after he had been such a compelling presence in Nod Krai, I hoped this would be our true final confrontation. I also hoped for the other characters to return and have some story relevance. The Sumeru crew's found family vibes always felt like home, and I couldn't wait to feel that again. I was one of those who found those world quests a little exhausting at the time, so while I'd wish for them to fix their storytelling, in this case that was more from an analytical perspective for me, since I just don't have that personal investment in them which many others have. In the end, when it came to all that lore, I expected them to take the easy way out and focus on things which had already been given focus in the previous Archon Quests. Despite my lack of investment, I would still have seen that as a big mistake. The quest started strong, with a really interesting hook as we explored Collei's dream of a future where everyone's history had been scrambled, and the presentation for the first hour or so was perhaps even better than we've seen in Nod Krai. The cinematography was fantastic at times, and I kept noticing deft camera movements and clearer character emotions, and the whole experience felt like they were taking another step towards matching their competitors on this crucial point. That strong start faded a little as the majority of the quest fell back to the still decent but less impressive standards they've set in the past year, though the ending also got a little extra attention too. There was, however, a crucial section which had almost comically bad presentation: the siege of Sumeru City. The people of Sumeru had been evacuated and the Fatui invaded. In the lead up to the confrontation with Dottore, our protagonists headed back to fight their way through the enemy army and retake the city. When this section was set up, I was expecting something like the incredible sequence in Nutlands Act 4, where the smaller skirmishes we fought led to one of the best cinematics in the history of the game, which let you feel the adrenaline of the moment. Instead, the Battle of Sumeru felt like they just ran out of time or budget and scrounged together whatever they could as quickly as possible. This could have been one of the most iconic moments in the entire story, and I'm disappointed that it fell so flat instead, especially when contrasted to the great presentation elsewhere in the very same quest. This was, of course, not helped by the horrible teams we were forced to fight in, which made your average Imaginarium theatre team look like a meta showcase. I do not understand why they didn't at least have some of the Eremites we were allied with throw some dendro at the enemies, so the teams could at least do some reactions. As always, there's a disconnect between how dynamic the fights are in the cutscenes compared to how they feel in the gameplay sequences, but it is what it is. It's great to see them raise the bar even further. Now they have to reach that level consistently. After that opening sequence, Hoyo's decision on their big dilemma became clear. Where I had expected them to dismiss the lore and keep things lean, this quest brought in characters, context, and concepts from all of Sumeru's major world quests and made them central to the narrative. They managed to keep the recaps and reintroductions to a minimum, in part thanks to 3 quest quality of life improvements, which I'll touch on towards the end of the video. There were still some moments of slightly bloated exposition, but it was noticeably more streamlined than pretty much any other quest in the game, even though it had exponentially more ground to cover than usual. I suspect this will have felt just about acceptable for casuals who skipped the world quests entirely. As each group of characters met one another, the need for introductions provided space for them to share just about enough to explain what was going on without devolving into an info dump, especially with those 3 improvements helping avoid the worst of it. And for the people who loved those quests, I'd expect it was a great experience. The introductions and recaps themselves may even have been highlights for some, since it's always entertaining to see characters you already know and love cross paths, especially when each intro doesn't overstay its welcome. Personally, I fall into a kind of middle camp. I have played all the quests, but I mostly skimmed them since they either overstayed their welcome or frustrated me to no end because I wanted to explore on my own instead of doing a guided tour. That meant I did not get those moments of emotional catharsis that I'd imagine the many who loved these quests must have felt, but the sprinkles of information they included to jog your memory brought back all the context I needed, and it was still satisfying to see all those hours spent learning about these more obscure areas of the world become relevant to the story at last. There were still slow moments, and there have been quests I enjoyed much more, but this was a better compromise than I'd have ever hoped for. But the biggest surprise for me was just how many of those characters showed genuine growth, or at the very least some continuation of their story. When we say things like, I wish the characters would exist outside of the one patch where they were introduced, some people pretend we want the characters to just show up and stand there, or maybe bloat the dialogue even more. It's hard to tell if they're trolling, or if they're genuinely failing to understand. This quest showcases what we actually want, for characters' lives to continue beyond the confines of their moment in the spotlight, for the world to feel alive. Collei probably gets the most focus. At the start of the quest, she already demonstrates some growth from the timid, awkward teenager she was back when we first met her. It feels like her life continued while we were off in distant lands, exactly the kind of thing which makes the world feel alive. That trajectory continues through the quest as she visibly gains confidence and assertiveness. By the end of the quest, she's cleansed of the god's remains which have plagued her for so long, and she even qualifies as a fully fledged forest ranger. That last point was so great to see. Gachas tend to leave their characters in a weird stasis where their place in the world never changes, no matter how much time has passed. The way they handled Collei here is a huge step in the right direction. Nahida's progress is similar. At the end of the academia arc, she was beginning to believe in herself, but she was not yet a leader. In this quest, she shows vulnerability, and the people around her step in to support her at times, but it feels like people rallying behind their leader rather than the rescuing of a helpless child we saw before. She shows a willingness to make morally difficult choices and plays a key role in saving the world. Nahida is probably still my favorite character in the entire game, and a major reason I loved so much of this quest. The biggest shock when it came to character growth, however, was Paimon. She takes initiative and splits from the Traveler in the hope she can contribute on her own. Her conversation with Wanderer felt so true to her as a character, and yet it was fantastic to see such introspection and growth from her. A culmination of the more subtle changes she's shown over the years, which points to depths of character we'll hopefully explore more in the future. Wanderer, too, showed continued growth, and his gruff mentor role in that same conversation was a highlight. I disliked him when his playable persona first appeared, but over the years since, he's slowly grown on me, and this quest did a great job of continuing his progress. And, amazingly, many of the side characters had some movement going on as well. We got moments of closure, like Jet's encounter with her father, or Lilo Par's final moments. We got people confronting their limits, like the Aranaras revealing themselves to the humans, a Pep agreeing to help out despite all her resistance, or Nefer returning to her homeland despite the trauma she associates with it. And there's all the inter-character relationships which felt dynamic and alive. That had always been a strength of Sumeru, but with the sheer quantity of characters this time, it felt even more compelling. I've seen some people say they felt everything between the intro and the finale was boring filler. To those of us who care more about stories first and cinema second, all of this growth and change made that filler into the main course. And while we're looking at it from a high-level perspective, I found it fitting that a major theme which felt central throughout this quest was the weight of past mistakes. Everything in Sumeru is of course steeped in unfinished histories, burdens left behind for new generations to carry, old wounds resurfacing, and, most importantly, people accepting responsibility for the past. This theme was pretty central to the region all along, but the inclusion of all these side characters into one cohesive story made that theme feel incredibly potent. And I can't help but think it's particularly fitting as a central theme for this point in the life of the game, as Hoyo themselves begin to confront the mistakes they've made across the years and perhaps find ways to fix them. Naturally, one of the most anticipated aspects of this quest was the return of Dottore, arguably the most compelling villain in the game. His part was a little smaller than I had expected. We don't learn much about his history or why he is the way he is, and I'll just have to hope his past gets more exploration in Snezhnaya through the eyes of others who knew him. I enjoyed his relationship with Pantalone, and their conversation while the Sumeru crew were retaking the city was one of the most gripping parts of the story, especially since it showed a slightly different side to him. He came across as an even more nuanced and fascinating character without even a hint of an excuse for his utterly deranged and unforgivably evil machinations, and their interactions left me excited to see more of Pantalone too. It's kinda sad to see such potential come to an end, and it's also a shame that there wasn't space for a true payoff for Scaramouche's vendetta. However, the more compelling a villain becomes, the harder it is to reach a satisfying conclusion to their story. They add so much that it's tempting to invent reasons to bring them back from the dead, but every time that happens, it feels a little more contrived. As much as I've enjoyed his presence and would have loved to see more, I hope that the confirmation he did destroy his other segments means that his death is final. For me at least, this end felt like a fitting one. His casual destruction of the other segments came back to haunt him as they dragged him into the void, and the cinematic was simply fantastic. And perhaps the most anticipated moment was the burning of Irminsul, a cataclysmic event which had been foreshadowed years ago at the end of the Winter Night's Lazzo, which seemed to describe it as a little experiment in blasphemy. There's a fascinating difference between stories where you don't know what's going to happen, where the main appeal is that feeling of suspense, and ones where you already know what the outcome will be, and the driving question is how things end up that way. The latter are less common since they're harder to write in a way which feels engaging, but they can be just as gripping. In this case, I think they did a pretty solid job. The journey is engaging, and the big twist is that Nahida set the fire using the pyrognoses, not Dottore as we had all assumed for so long. A lot of people are frustrated that such a seismic event seemed to have no immediate consequences. All the data the tree contained was safely transferred to Aru, and at first glance nothing is different. It was undeniably a moment which should have felt more significant. It could have been marked by something as small as a brief cutscene at the end, where we catch our first glimpse of the heavenly principles. Even if they had merely turned their head towards the flames in the distance, it would have been an acknowledgement of the gravity of what just happened. That said, others have messed with Irminsul's data in often profound ways in the past, and Celestia never reacted. It's possible the presence of the Shades was that reaction. They went in person and asked Nahida to confirm that she really wanted to do this. Depending on how you look at it, that could be considered a symbolic moment, as the people of Teyvat took a decisive step which rejects the gifts and restrictions bestowed upon them by the heavenly principles. I've seen some argue it's even worse, that it means our protagonists have free reign to rewrite everything that happens from now on, and there are no longer any stakes to the story. Unless I'm missing something, it seems pretty clear that they could have done that at any point already, and the reason they didn't was that it's crazy difficult and causes unintended consequences. I see no reason to believe it's any different now. I understand why, for many, the level of trust in Hoyo is so low that their default assumption is the worst possible interpretation. It would have felt more fitting for some more consequences to have been felt already. But personally, after seeing clear improvements on every complaint I raised in the past, I'm willing to wait and see if they can give this moment the significance it deserves. One thing I find kinda weird is that the Archon Quest provided Nicole's ascension rewards. Throughout Nod Krai, character story quests have been merged into the Archon Quest, and we've gotten the story quest rewards if we completed the quest within a time limit. This was hit and miss in my opinion. Lauma's was pretty much perfect, Flynn's barely had one at all, and the Nephis was good but out of place. Columbina was the star of almost the entire story, while Linnea and Durin had their own isolated quests. Nicole doesn't quite fit. She stole the show when we first met her, but now that it's ostensibly her patch, she was much less prominent. We already knew her well enough to not need that level of focus, but as a Nicole fan, I still wish they'd added a truly dedicated story quest for her. Her little chronicles have been fun so far, but they also don't feel like they're about her. I still think embedding character growth and changes into the Archon Quest is overall a massive positive to how engaging and alive the story feels, but it should not have come at the expense of those extra stories where we take the time to dive a little deeper. And finally, the epilogue. For me, this was probably the story's weakest point. It was a little jarring how quickly we went from one of the most impactful and dramatic moments in the entire game so far to an oddly chill, drawn-out denouement which firmly focused on paying off the promises for background stories without referencing the importance of what just happened. I do think the things it included were important, and I'm not opposed to letting them take the time they need. Collei's emotional journey was the framing narrative of this whole chapter of the story, so it is fitting to end with her finding closure with the removal of the god remains, which caused her so much suffering at long last. Tying up those loose ends did make sense, it's just a shame that the presentation robbed that climactic moment of some of its potency. I think on balance, they should have dwelled on the burning of Irminsul a little longer and shown some hints of consequences beginning to take shape, since that might have made the longer denouement which followed feel more fitting. And before we get to how this quest affects what I'm expecting from Snezhnaya, I mentioned earlier that I'd highlight 3 quests quality of life improvements introduced in this version. The first is the guiding notes feature, which adds a shortcut to a glossary of relevant info about characters and concepts, explained in-world as a notebook of important information Paimon has been keeping track of. This is a pretty solid solution to part of the problem. It means that people unfamiliar with a character or a concept can get a quick summary if they feel confused, while those who played the quest don't have to sit through an extra recap or reintroduction. This doesn't do anything to replicate the emotional connections people feel towards the characters, and it only gives the smallest slice of context, but it's a great way to give just enough to avoid confusion without affecting the experience for everyone else. And second, they finally started doing something I've been requesting for years, using the split dialogue options as a skip button. There were moments where the conversation touched on some point of lore or character history we encountered in the past, and normally they'd launch into a recap just to help out the people who hadn't been paying attention. This is the source of much of the dialogue bloat that makes the quests frustrating. Many times in the past, I've pointed out that they don't even need to build anything new to fix this. Just have someone ask the traveler if they know what they're talking about and let the player say yes or no. If the player says no, share that context through a few extra lines of dialogue. If the player says they already know, skip the explanation. If they do that, everybody gets what they want, and they can do it for free. I'm so happy they finally took that step. The final feature also addresses another point I've been complaining about, the struggle to figure out when would be a good time to take a break. Genshin's quests have become ever longer over time, and they've made some tweaks which have made them more immersive, but these more immersive quests come with their own downsides. A common complaint in previous years was that the quests were littered with moments where a conversation finished and you were given control of your character and directed to walk a few meters, then yet another static conversation would begin. It felt jarring and annoying, one of those rough edges which made the experience less immersive. They fixed this in Nod Krai by just moving things along automatically, which made it more immersive, but it turns out those moments had a benefit. They had been a natural point where you knew you could take a break. You can just exit the quest most of the time, but you lose some progress when you do, and many of us had the frustrating experience of repeating 20 minutes or more of yapping just because we had to stop playing for a while. Many would keep playing in the hopes of reaching one of those natural breakpoints, only to find they no longer exist. The solution I asked for was some kind of estimate of how long a section will take before you started. Instead, Hoyo gave us a timer which tells us how long has passed since the last auto-save point. This is an even better approach which completely solves the problem for me. With all that said, where does this quest leave us looking forward to Snezhnaya? For one thing, it gives me hope they'll actually explore the Harbingers with something approaching the depth they deserve. If they put in this much effort when paying respect to Sumeru's side characters, surely they'll try to make the Harbingers justify their gravitas somehow. They have been a constant presence since the start of the game, and while many feel they've strayed too far from their initial reputation as a malevolent force working against the good people, I've quite enjoyed the more nuanced approach they've taken to most of the ones we've known. I hope there's one or two who are as compelling and irredeemable villains as Dottore turned out to be, but even better if there's nuance and disagreements among them too. There are already some interesting threads I hope they'll explore. I'd love to see Columbina revisit her time there with her fresh perspective, and especially her dynamic with both Sandroni and Arlecchino. There's also the possibility that Capitano and Wanderer may both have a part to play, and even the last lingering hope of Signora means that their waifu will return somehow. And if not, perhaps we'll see some new blood join their side. Another unresolved thread which was tied into this quest, and then left even more unresolved, was the question of the Pyrognoses. After Natlan, I'd always assumed the question was how the Fatui would get their hands on the Gnosis, since it seemed inevitable that they would eventually. It's interesting that it's described as disappeared. That could mean anything at this point. The simplest answer would be that Pantaloni took it, but perhaps there's something else at play instead. It'll be interesting to see how this gets resolved. In the end, Snezhnaya will have different problems to the ones which plagued this quest. The Fatui have been present since Mondstadt. The Harbingers have been woven into the main quest at every step. The Gnosis, the Tsaritsa, the antagonism towards Celestia, none of this is buried in optional side content that half the player base skipped. For the first time, Hoyo are heading into a region where the foundations were already in place. I'm excited to see what they can build from there. So, have Hoyo figured out how to handle the weight of their past mistakes? I think their approach in this quest is another acknowledgement of the things that they got wrong. It doesn't hide from that, and seeks a middle ground which could still work for someone uninterested in the lore it built upon, while rewarding Sumeru's greatest fans with what they've craved for years. The epilogue was a bit jarring, the battle for Sumeru City was undercooked, and for people who weren't already invested, many of the emotional moments passed with a shrug. But to me, this story's flaws were a necessary balance which set the tone for how they'll take things forward from here, with respect for the time we've spent playing the game. After years of watching Hoyo let the good parts of what they built fade into the background, this felt like something different. And that, more than anything, is what we've been asking for. Until next time.